All right, so that's what oligopoly is. It's an important market structure in which there are a few large firms that entirely comprise the industry. Um, and so these firms are not perfectly competitive, obviously, because there's only a handful or so firms, at least only a few firms relative to perfect competition. And they're not even monopolistically competitive. And because there are several of them, of course, it's not a monopoly. So it's kind of this interesting firm structure that's, far from the competitive end of the spectrum where we have perfect competition and monopolistic competition, but clearly it's not a monopoly since there's more than one firm. So it's an interesting middle ground. So in oligopoly, there are very few sellers. And because of this, each seller knows that the other sellers will react to its changes in prices and quantity. There's some interdependence going on that we didn't have on the competitive end of our spectrum, where there were so many firms, both with perfectly competitive industries and monopolistically competitive industries. There were so many firms that they kind of acted independently from what other firms that they were competing with did, right? They didn't really care about what they were doing. They just, you followed the profit maximizing rule, set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue to determine the quantity or the level of output that maximized profit. Now, for monopolistically competitive firms, they then had to determine the price using their downward sloping demand curve to determine the price at which they could sell that profit maximizing quantity, as opposed to perfectly competitive firms that just take the prices given from the market. But here with oligopoly, there's so few firms that they actually are reacting to one another, right? If so-and-so, my competition, does this, then, well, my best choice is to do this, right? So there's some interdependence going on. Okay? And in fact, that interdependence is strategic, right? They're trying to make best moves based on each other's actions, right? What's the best thing for me to do if my competition does this? Or if they do this, what's my best response, right? What's my best course of action? That's called strategic dependence. Right? So it's the situation where one firm's actions with respect to price or quality or quantity or advertising and other related changes may be strategically countered by the reactions of one or more firms in the industry. So if you've ever played the game Monopoly, or any similar game, but Monopoly is a great example, you basically were playing a game of oligopoly. Now, the goal is to become a monopoly so that you're the only one left. But while you're playing, right, you're playing a game of oligopoly, in fact, even though it's called monopoly, right? And so when somebody buys one piece of property, your actions might change depending on which property they buy, right? So that's a good example of oligopoly and strategic dependence. Now, such dependence only exists when there are relatively few firms. If there's lots and lots of firms, like our more competitive end of the spectrum, then this interdependence starts to disappear and eventually goes away because there's so many firms that any one firm's actions are so small relative to the industry that they don't really matter in a strategic sense. So this only happens when there's very few firms. Now, why do oligopolies occur? Well, economies of scale. So some of the similar answers that we had for why monopolies occur, right? Economies of scale. So again, that situation where average total cost is always getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Barriers to entry. So just like monopoly as well, if it's hard for new firms to enter, then that limits the amount of competition. And so the few firms that do exist get to enjoy their limited competition. And then there's also mergers. So anytime that there are mergers between companies and two or more companies become one company, that limits the amount of competition there is. And so it pushes firms further from the competitive end of the spectrum, closer to monopoly, into the oligopoly range of the competitive spectrum. And there's two types of mergers. There's vertical mergers, right? So vertical, up and down. And there's horizontal mergers. So a vertical merger would be when a company merges with another business that's in its supply chain vertically. So an example would be if Chick-fil-A merged with Purdue Chicken, right? So Purdue Chicken maybe supplies Chick-fil-A with its chicken. And so if they were to merge, that would be a vertical merger, right? It's when it's the joining of a firm with another to which it sells an output or from which it buys an input, right? So just like Purdue Chicken and Chick-fil-A, perhaps. Whereas a horizontal merger is when basically two direct competitors merge. So that'd be like Chick-fil-A and Popeyes merging. That would be a horizontal merger. All right. So let's real quickly talk about oligopoly and how it relates to efficiency and resource allocation. So to whatever extent oligopolists have market power, which we'll talk about in a second, it's the ability to individually affect the market price for the industry's output. They lead to resource misallocations just as monopolies do. So hopefully you're seeing a theme here, which is that as we get further from the competitive end of the spectrum and closer to the monopoly end of the spectrum, industries get less efficient and they get worse at allocating resources efficiently. Okay, so since oligopolies are much closer to the monopoly end of the spectrum, of course, they are much more inefficient and bad at resource allocation. But there is a caveat, okay? There is an exception to this, and that's when oligopolies occur due to economies of scale. When this happens, in this one instance, it actually might be the case that consumers end up paying lower prices, which is generally pushes us towards efficient outcomes. So there is one exception to this, and that's when the oligopolies occur because of economies of scale. But all in all, there's no definitive evidence of serious resource misallocation in the United States because of oligopolies. So kind of interesting. Theoretically, there should be a lot of inefficiency and resource misallocation due to oligopoly, but actually, as it turns out, there's not a lot of empirical evidence for that. And there actually is a theoretical explanation for this that we'll talk about when we get to the section on game theory. All right, so the more U.S. firms face competition from the rest of the world, the less any current oligopoly will be able to exercise market power. So this might be one reason why the data doesn't support the inefficiency of oligopoly. It could be that, well, when we think about the entire world and not just the U.S., there is a lot of competition out there. So maybe they're not as much of an oligopoly as we first thought.